Certain fights, certain matchups seem like an inevitability, as if they were fated to occur. You can just see the pieces falling into place. Whether it's two clear-cut greats in a division who haven't clashed yet, or rivalries yet unfulfilled, there's just a feeling you get that those two combatants are meant to fight each other. But life and reality don't give a shit about any of that, and plenty of fighters have played spoiler to some incredible matchups over the years. And today we're going to count down the 10 fights that shattered fate and ruined the prospects of a bout we fans could feel in our bones was coming. I'm Tommy from MMA On Point, and these are 10 destiny-breaking fights in MMA history. Number 10. Manabu Yamada spoils Ken vs. Frank Shamrock. How legendary would it have been for Frank and Ken Shamrock to fight each other in the 90s? We all want to see it. Any brother duo in mixed martial arts, it's only natural to wonder how it would have gone down, especially with such a legendary family. Ken was the star at the time, and Frank was just getting started. Truth be told, the two had a massive falling out when Frank left the team to form his own gym, and it took many years for them to reconcile. Rumors of a fight between the brothers coming off and on during that time period, but it could have all gone down at the inaugural King of Pancrase tournament in 1994. It should have gone down. Frank and Ken were destined to fight like Billy and Jimmy at the end of Double Dragon. In the first round of the tourney, Frank would defeat Boss Rutan in his pro debut to advance to the quarters, with Ken submitting Alex Cook in his first bout, and then going on to submit future heavyweight champion Maurice Smith in his second fight of the night. But it's here where fate would be denied. Manabu Yamada would catch Frank with an Achilles lock, ending his run in the tournament. Yamada would go on to the final against Ken, or Wayne Shamrock if you're so inclined, and lose the openweight championship, leaving Frank and his brother Shadow until he carved his own legacy in the UFC in 1997. Number 9. Chuck Liddell spoils Tito vs. Randleman. Kevin Randleman once said, "I like every fighter but Tito Ortiz," but unfortunately the two would never fight in the cage thanks to the Iceman. Randleman would lose his heavyweight title to Randy Couture at UFC 28, and then from there decide he should fight at a more natural weight for his body. The monster was only 5'10", so light heavy seemed a better fit. Of course, given his status as a heavyweight and his incredible wrestling pedigree, many assumed he would be a major problem for then champion Ortiz, who was 2 defenses into his championship run with the company. It was a highly anticipated matchup, and all Randleman needed to do was win his debut in the division to get it. Unfortunately for him, he ran into Chuck Liddell starting his meteoric rise, and at UFC 31, he was KO'd by the future champion in the first round. Kevin would only have one more UFC fight before he decided to head to Japan, and although his beef with Ortiz remained throughout his active career, the two would never appear in the same promotion again. It's an interesting what-if fight given Randleman's style, but thanks to the Iceman, we'll never know how it might have gone down. Number 8. Robbie Lawler spoils Rory Mac vs. Hendricks. In 2013, Rory MacDonald was seen as the heir apparent of the welterweight division. He was the protege of George St. Pierre, there to take up his mantle of Canadian excellence once GSP decided to walk away from the sport. Rory was 6-1 in the UFC with 5 straight wins. At UFC 167, the very same pay-per-view that St. Pierre would narrowly and controversially defeat Johnny Hendricks before taking some time away from the sport, aka vacating the title and never fighting at welterweight again, MacDonald was in prime position to pick up right where George left off. He could finish the work that Rush started with Johnny Hendricks. It was almost like the plot of a bad martial arts movie. All he needed to do was win the feature bout that night against the resurgent Robbie Lawler. The two put on a banger, but 2 of 3 judges would score the fight for ruthless, and Rory would have to wait for his chance to assume the 170-pound throne. When the dust settled after 2 fights with Hendricks, it would be Robbie who now held the title, and after a 3-fight winning streak, Rory would finally get his chance at the gold, just not against Big Rig. Their second fight was an all-time classic, and it would be the second time Robbie would deny the Red King. Number 7. Gabriel Gonzaga spoils Couture vs. Cro Cop. Mirko Cro Cop had all the momentum in the world entering the UFC, having just won the 2006 Pride Openweight Grand Prix by defeating Josh Barnett. But the UFC wasn't too sure fans in the US would know much about him, so instead of giving him a fight with then-champion Tim Sylvia, they decided to throw Cro Cop a floater by making his debut against poor Eddie Sanchez. A month later, Randy Couture would come out of retirement and shock the world by regaining the heavyweight title. Holy shit, Cro Cop's in the UFC, Randy Couture is now champion. What a dream fight this will be. Some of the best of Pride versus the best of the UFC. No, the UFC still wanted Mirko to be more established in the promotion, so instead of fighting Couture right away, he would have to beat Gabriel Gonzaga in a title eliminator. Oops, that was a mistake. In an all-time classic reversal of expectation, Gonzaga brutally KO'd Cro Cop with a head kick, the Croatian signature finisher. Gabriel would go on to lose to Couture, and Mirko would never end up fighting Randy at any point. What a screw-up this one was, UFC.
You had one job. Just the one.
Number 6. Maurice Smith spoils Couture versus the Hammer. A fight between Randy Couture and Mark Coleman seemed like an inevitability in the late 90s. The two were both Olympic-level wrestlers in an era of the UFC where grapplers were king. Coleman would win the UFC 10 and 11 tournaments before becoming the inaugural heavyweight champion at UFC 12. Randy entered the promotion and won the UFC 13 tournament. He would get his shot at the title after an upset win against Vitor Belfort at UFC 15. Unfortunately, that title shot would not be against the Hammer, though. At UFC 14, kickboxer Maurice Smith would shockingly stave off Coleman's grappling to win the fight via unanimous decision after 21 minutes, and thus it was Smith who Couture would defeat to capture his first bit of UFC gold. A fight at UFC 17 was booked between Randy and Mark, but the Natural had to pull out with an injury, and the two would depart from the promotion for a time, never lining back up for a fight until 2010 at UFC 109. But of course, by that point, the fight was more nostalgia than anything, as both fighters were already in the UFC Hall of Fame. Number 5. Tsuyoshi Kosaka spoils Fedor versus Randy. In 2008, the fight to make was Randy Couture and Fedor Emelianenko. Everybody wanted to know what would happen if the two greatest heavyweights in the world finally clashed. And while the fight never materialized, it almost happened nearly a decade earlier, if not for a single missed punch. Dateline Osaka, Japan, the year 2000. Both Fedor and Couture have entered the 32-man Rings King of Kings tournament. The first 2 rounds fought on single nights in different blocks. If they both make it through 2 opponents, they will meet in the quarterfinal. Couture did his part in October, defeating Jeremy Horn and Yushi Yanagasawa. Fedor would go the distance in a victory over Ricardo Arona, but suffer some damage over his right eye, which would open up far worse after an errant elbow sliced Emelianenko open, with the first missed punch thrown by Tsuyoshi Kosaka in the second bout of the night. The doctor would ultimately call the fight, and since this was a tournament, even though elbows were illegal, Kosaka would advance to the next round, where he would lose to Couture. Considering that beyond this one bout, Fedor would go unbeaten for nearly a decade, I think it's safe to say he would have advanced, and we would finally know how Randy and the Last Emperor would have matched up, at least early in their careers. Number 4. Rampage Jackson spoils Chuck versus Vandy. It's the early 2000s, and Vanderlei Silva is arguably the greatest fighter in the world. As Pride middleweight champion, Vandy is on an 11-fight run in the division and on his way to winning the 2003 Grand Prix. Dana White sent his only son Chuck Liddell over to Pride for the tournament in a cross-promotional deal of sorts to prove the best 205ers resided in the UFC. All the stars were aligning with both fighters cruising through the first round, a bout between them to be the highly anticipated conclusion of Pride Final Conflict 2003. Rampage Jackson didn't give a shit about fate though, beating on Chuck late in their semifinal matchup and forcing his corner to throw in the towel. Page would go on to lose to Vandy later that night. Liddell would go home and have his Hall of Fame run as UFC light heavyweight champion, a prime matchup lost. Another promotional crossover between the two stars was going to happen in 2006 when both were still at the top, but fell apart after Vandy lost a heavyweight fight to Mirko Cro Cop. Silva would lose his middleweight title to Dan Henderson before joining the UFC, and Chuck dropped his belt in a rematch with Jackson at UFC 71. The two would finally meet 4 years after that fateful tournament, but by then it simply wasn't the fight it could have been. Number 3. Miesha Tate spoils the Rousey Holm rematch. Oh, the millions and millions of dollars that were lost because of this one. If there was ever going to be a rematch in the UFC, it was going to be Holly Holm versus Ronda Rousey. The two met at UFC 193 for the bantamweight strap at the height of Rousey's popularity as a pay-per-view draw, and the preacher's daughter took it to the champ in spectacular fashion. The whole world lost their minds. Of course there would be a rematch. That's where the real money is. But Ronda would take some time away from the sport, a whole year in fact, and Holm was not going to be a champion that sat around and waited. Instead, she insisted on another fight, and that March took on Miesha Tate at UFC 196. Holly was on her way to a decision victory and millions of dollars in a rematch when late in round 5, Tate pulled off a Hail Mary rear naked choke and put Holm to sleep to capture UFC gold. Rematch ruined. Dana White would later say Holm should have waited for Ronda. No shock there. This would be the start of a 3-fight skid for Holly. Tate would lose the title to Amanda Nunes, who would then seal the deal on Ronda's career when she did return. Of all the fights destined to occur on our list, you would think Dana White would have preserved this one with his life. It's pretty amazing the UFC let this one get away. Number 2. Mirko Cro Cop spoils Fedor vs. Barnett several times. Josh Barnett's white whale has forever been Fedor Emelianenko. He wanted to be the best and would have claim to it during that era if he defeated the Russian. He came to Pride so he could fight him. Years later, he would turn down a return to the UFC in order to chase after him. His 2 best shots would be thwarted by another Mariner on the hunt for the last Emperor though, and that was Mirko Cro Cop. Barnett entered Pride as a top-tier heavyweight. He was 18-1 on an 8-fight win streak and had captured both the UFC heavyweight title as well as the Pancrase Openweight Championship, which he defended twice. Much was made of his debut against Mirko Cro Cop, and a win here would have guaranteed a chance at Fedor's heavyweight title. Unfortunately, a freak injury in the first round would lead to a year away, and then he would lose the rematch via unanimous decision. His next opportunity would come a year later in the 2006 Openweight Grand Prix. Unfortunately, in the final, he would again meet Cro Cop, a fight away from a position guaranteed to secure a match with Fedor. But Barnett would submit to punches in the first round. When Mirko left for the UFC, Pride gave Josh the go-ahead to fight Fedor, but he opted out of the bout, citing his current condition at that time. His final real opportunity would come at Affliction MMA's 2009 event, but he failed the drug test and sunk the promotion. So close, yet so far. Number 1. Justin Gaethje spoils Tony vs. Khabib. It had to be number 1. If there's ever been a fight that was both doomed to never take place, but also fated by the MMA gods themselves, it was Tony Ferguson versus Khabib Nurmagomedov. Our 5-year journey to figure out the best lightweight in the world started in 2015. It's then that the two get matched up for the first time. Tony on a 6-fight run, Khabib, well, you know, unbeaten as he still is. An injury to the Eagles scrapped their first encounter. They tried again in 2016 after Ferguson added another win to his streak, but El Kukui had to drop out with injury this time. Both fighters would win a pair of bouts before a third attempt to match them up in 2017 for interim gold, but a tiramisu later and the fight was off again. Tony would go on to win the interim belt that October in a bout against Kevin Lee. Khabib moved to 25-0, and now we're in 2018 and the fight is on again. April Fools, Ferguson tripped over a wire and shredded his knee. Khabib wins the title and gets into this thing with Conor you might have heard about. Tony wins a few more fights. It's late 2019. They booked the fight a 5th time for spring of 2020 when a global pandemic traps Khabib in Russia, and the fight is off again. Opting to tempt fate rather than wait, Tony agreed to a new opponent at UFC 249 in Justin Gaethje, who managed to put the one roadblock in front of this fight that even a worldwide pandemic could not: a defeat to one of the 2 streaking stars. And with that, it's likely that arguably the most anticipated matchup in UFC history will never happen, or at the very least, lose quite a bit of its luster if it ever does. Thanks for watching. Please give us a like and subscribe. We've got 3 new videos or more for you every single week. Let us know what you thought of the video in the comments below. Huge shout out to Max Randall for editing this video together. Follow him on Twitter at Max_Randall. Follow On Point MMA on Twitter, and have yourself a wonderful day.